on this computer. All right.
Okay, hi, Jeffe.
Hi, Melinda.
I really appreciate your asking me to do this and reciprocation because you were so sweet to do my interview for the Wildcards novel. So,
Back when we could do things in public.
yeah, back when we got to not be social distancing and have nobody around us. So anyway, I've read both books. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it very much. And I wanted to talk to you about this new one about the fiery crown. And I guess I'm going to start with, was Hawaii sort of the, invasion of white invaders or white, colonialists, and the effects of gunpowder on a native population? Was that sort of where you were starting from with this series?
I guess in part it was that. I would say that I think more in terms of the Caribbean than Hawaii.
Okay.
But certainly that idea of the invaders coming in and displacing people. The other thing I was thinking about, and I think, because you're local, you often go to our wonderful local science fiction and fantasy con, Bubonicon. And there was a panel there a couple of years ago, and I don't remember if you were on it with me, but we talked about why is fantasy so often set in non-tech environments? Why is it so often like the Tolkien-esque, we have only swords and bows and arrows? And It was an interesting discussion, and I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, it doesn't have to be that way. And so when I set to write this world, I thought, well, what if it's one that's sort of on the verge of industrialization, with this sort of discovery of a gunpowder-like substance, and how is that changing the social stratification and displacing magic, perhaps. We always have this idea, right, that somehow technology and magic don't coexist well. So I wanted to play with those ideas.
Yeah, because the whole, I've argued with George about this because at one point in one of his Game of Thrones books, he had this thing where he was like, he has a sword that's 5,000 years old. And I thought, in 5,000 years, they haven't made any advancement. There's something really wrong with this culture, and maybe the bad winter thing is part of it, but still, 5,000 years, you kind of would think they would be beyond that. So I was, and I like that juxtaposition. And there's also the argument that technology democratizes a society, because if magic is limited to only those who can use magic or have those skills, then it becomes a very stratified society, and that technology actually levels and makes it, if you have access to the gunpowder. What's the old saying? God didn't make men and women equal, Colonel Holt did.
I've never heard that one. That's great.
I actually have loved that phrase because, if you can stand on your own. So I just, and yet you seem to be coming down, except you have a tension between your two characters, because one is, he is relying on the technology, and your other central character is much more of a, nature magic kind of figure. So how did you wanted to set up that conflict, I take it, from the...
Yes, because that's sort of the essential conflict of the romance structure, is that there's going to be the hero and heroine that are, forced into a marriage of convenience, that there's that inherent conflict, but then to have them come from very different places always makes the tension between them more interesting, and makes them have to reassess themselves and come up with new skills in order to sort of grow as human beings. And so that's kind of, with writing romantic fantasy or fantasy romance, however you split it out, it's the fantasy world, but also that romantic tension that's driving a whole lot of the internal conflict.
Okay, that makes sense. One of the things I found really interesting reading the book, and I'm actually grateful for, is that you use a lot of contemporary language between the characters, and I find that refreshing, because I'm a little bit like Tony Stark. art thou wearing mother's drapes? Kind of, that sort of faux, high fantasy language that, it's like they wouldn't think of themselves as using thou and thee and thou'st and, so on. I mean, they would be talking in colloquialisms. And so was that a conscious choice on your part to go away from sort of the high fantasy, elegant, stilted language, shall we say?
It absolutely is. And I've received flack for it because some readers interpret that as you not having your fantasy cred, because they're like, well, it doesn't read like Tolkien. And this is one of my beefs. I had a conversation with someone a while back. We were putting together a fantasy story bundle, and there were books in the bundle that he said, well, I don't think these are fantasy. And I said, yes, they are. And he said, well, when I think fantasy, I think Tolkien. I'm like, well, you and a lot of other people, but even though Tolkien is obviously one of the pillars of the fantasy canon, we also have to keep in mind that, for instance, Lord of the Rings was published over 65 years ago now. Yeah. And Tolkien started writing 100 years ago. And it was a totally different culture, and there aren't many genres where we insist on incorporating the language used by someone who was writing 100 years ago. And it is all an artifice, because if I were truly writing in the language of that world, it wouldn't be English. So
yeah, well,
exactly what I was going
for. Look at, oh God, I'm blanking. The Canterbury Tales. I mean, there was a sort of roughness to that language and a bawdiness that, like I said, at the time they were talking, I mean, I presume in courtly language, if you were in a diplomatic situation at the court, that would be one thing, but the average person in the street, and while you have one courtly character, your other character has not had that, that background. And Mike Siamese has joined us. So.
Yes, I'm so glad he did.
Come on, old man, you can come and be part of it. So, yeah, so I agree with you. I mean, I think that, I mean, in some ways, George redefined high fantasy, and that he made it, darker and bloodier and more brutal than a Tolkien. I mean, and don't get me wrong, I love Tolkien. I've read.
I love Tolkien too.
7 times, but we can't be in a straitjacket when we write.
Yes, and I feel like, when you get to write, the science fiction where you're going with a semi-near future science fiction, and that gives you the freedom to take modern language and move it up, develop new colloquialisms. And yeah, with fantasy, with this idea that somehow must be always art thou, it's so limited.
Wearing mother's drapes.
Yes. Let's leave mother's drapes behind.
Yeah, that's cool. The other thing is, I write series too, because I love series. I love to read series. I want to spend time with characters, but it sounds like you've planned this as a trilogy. Is that correct? Or
I did, partly because we sold it as a trilogy, and partly because in the past I have not been brilliant at confining myself to a trilogy. So I was really trying to do a better job this time of shaping it into a tighter 3-book arc. Okay.
So that brings me to my next question, which is, oftentimes when it is a 3-book, people often say that the second act of any play or the second book of any trilogy, slumps, that it isn't as powerful. Did you have that in mind, and how did you want to try to address that?
Yes, I did. When we were emailing, you mentioned The Two Towers, which is one of the, as long as we're with Lord of the Rings, as being one of the famous examples of a book that many people consider to be a bridge book, or it's basically the middle 50% of one book. And you said that you love The Two Towers personally.
Yeah, I love that book. I actually like it better in some ways than The Return of the King. I think just because the sense of building that team and, you know, creating to me was so powerful. But, you know, but also horses, lots of horses.
Oh, now we get it.
Yeah,
Yes, all
yeah,
right.
no, I mean, you know, the Riders of Rohan and Shadowfax, and I was like, okay, I'm on board with that, you know.
Yeah, okay, all right. I buy that.
But I do know a lot of people consider that book to be like, ugh, you know, I have to slog through that, and I'm like, but please don't make me slog through Mordor again with Sam and Frodo, you know.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's as excruciating to read as what it's trying to convey.
Right.
Mordor. So yes, I did very much have that in mind, that I wanted the second book to be that it could stand alone if necessary, and that it would be a full story in and of itself. And I think that's part of what happens in middle books of trilogies, is that they don't quite have that beginning, middle, and end, and
Oh,
people
right.
feel unsatisfied with the arc of it, that there's no internal arc to the story. And so, yes, I really wanted to be careful to have a full internal arc. And then also, I got a piece of advice a long time ago when I first started writing, uh, and I couldn't tell you where it came from, but basically they said, don't hold back on your ideas, don't save things.
Mhm.
So if you have a great idea, don't save it for the next book. Do it now, because you'll always get more ideas.
Right, they're cheap.
They're cheap. Ideas are cheap. And I thought, well, that's a really good advice, because it is tempting to save ideas. You know, when you're thinking, oh, well, I have this great idea for a sea battle, but I'm going to save it for the climactic third book. And I think maybe that happens sometimes, that people are saving things for that third book. And so the second book kind of gets cannibalized of the cool stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, it's funny because when I was breaking into Hollywood, that's the advice that George gave me. He put
Uh-huh.
it differently. I had this great idea for a spec script, and George had told me you never sell spec scripts. And then I said, well, I called him and I said, well, maybe I shouldn't write this particular idea for the spec if it's never going to sell. It's such a great idea. George said to me, never hoard your silver bullet.
Ah,
Which is the same, you know, don't save it for the next thing. And he was dead right, because I wrote The Measure of a Man and it launched my Hollywood career. And if I'd waited, that might never have happened if I had afforded that idea. So yeah, I can see that. That's really good advice.
and I think
Um,
I told you that that was my favorite Star Trek Next Generation episode before I even
you,
knew who you were. You know, I was like, oh wow. Uh,
but
so
yeah,
it's
no,
great advice.
yeah, it is great advice. It's always lead with the best thing you got, you know, and don't hold back. Um, you picked only to have your two main characters be your viewpoints, you know, all the way, and in first person for both of them, which was an interesting choice because they come from very different backgrounds and they're obviously of different genders. Um, and there are even more interesting differences, which I will not go into in case people haven't read it. We don't want any spoilers. How did you, are you satisfied with how well you felt like you had two different voices for Conry and for Leah? Or was
Hmm.
that, did you go back and say it out loud, or try to, or get a man to read his and you read hers so that you could hear how it was rhythming, or how did you do that?
I did not get a man to read it, mostly because I guess I should have. That would have been a good idea. But I did go back over and over, and I would read sections out loud. Um, Leah's voice is closer to my own voice, just because she's more educated and articulate, and she's more of a word person. She reads a lot. And
Well, she
so
reminded me of you because she's feisty. I was like, oh, look, it's Jeffe. Red and
there's
feisty.
some of me and Leah. Yeah, I'm not obviously a queen or magic, but yes, I wanted her to have that spine. I didn't want her to be I don't know, like not uncertain of herself. I wanted her to be someone who was raised to be queen, and she was going to do it to the utmost of her ability.
Right.
So it was easier for me to do her voice. And the hardest part was when I would go into writing Con's POV, that I would sometimes use phrasing that was a little bit too precious for him, or use words that he would not use. And I would have to go back and kind of raid his sections and sort of take them down to a more simple outlook. And
Right.
well,
Work with that. And in naming, I mean, you gave Leah, I'm using Leah because I can't begin to pronounce her actual name.
Euthalia.
Euthalia. Okay. I liked the fact that she had this sort of, you know, highfalutin name, and then this, you know, this good, nice little nickname. However, I felt I was frustrated in a good way, but I mean frustrated because there were all these side characters that I wanted to know more about, and I would like to have seen how they were, what they were doing. I mean, you never take us into the night court. And I was like, I need to see the night court. You keep referring to it. It's a nice tease. I'm hoping you're going to give us a taste of the night court in book 3.
I am. I just finished writing book 3 a couple weeks ago. And so it's called The Promised Queen. And yes, there is a couple of chapters that take place in the night court that I felt like, it felt like a little bit of an indulgence because it's not moving the overall fantasy arc forward for them to go into the night court. But at the same time, that was exactly my feeling. I thought, well, you know, I kept teasing about what goes on in the night court, and I felt like we need to spend a little bit of time there and see some of it.
Well, I mean, and Daniel Abraham and George, we had this sort of fantasy conference before Daniel wrote his wonderful Dagger in the Coin series. You know, sort of what is fantasy and what makes fantasy, and you know, one of the things that came out of that long 4-hour meeting here at my house was that the landscape itself is a character in fantasy, which I think you've done really, really well. Because you know, Calanthe.
I say Calanthe, but close enough, yeah.
Yeah, is a character, that island. And also, to me, culture, how that culture has developed in the night court is part of that culture. And so I don't feel like it would have been an indulgence because I'm curious, I want to know. I mean, it's obviously defined a lot of how that culture works. But I really, really love the languid young man whose name I can't remember. Percy? Is that, no, what's his name?
Oh yeah, Percy. Lord
Yes.
Percy.
Lord
with
Percy.
his nails. This is long nails.
With his long nails. And yeah, I love that character. And I guess, you know, I was like, I would have been okay if you had had more viewpoint characters, because you know, I would love to have heard more from him and know a bit more about him. He just really intrigued me and he made me laugh. So, and Ambrose, the wizard, I mean, you know, what's his story? So I think you could do a whole thing about those two guys and I would enjoy that. Do you have any thoughts about going into some of these other characters and building series off from them, or?
I have. You know, the third book still stays with Leah and Khan's alternating POVs and ties up their arc, although we do learn a lot about Ambrose and Merle. And then, yes, and Percy plays a larger role too. And it kind of ties up this initial arc of what's wrong with the world in the third book. But then, yeah, I would just love to, there's a lot of room for more adventures. I'd like to write more about Sandra too, the warrior woman.
Yeah, the warrior woman.
Yeah, I could see them all sort of going off on their separate adventures and doing things.
Right, right.
But you know, I've never actually written more than 2 POVs in a book. I've never done a multi-POV book, so that might be something to try next.
I mean, that's one of the things I love about being a writer, is you get to stretch your muscles and try something new, you know, with every book. I mean, this last one, I just finished a novel, and for the first time it had, God help me, 5 viewpoint characters.
Wow.
And you know, I had gone from 2 and then I was 3 and 4. And then this one, it was like, in order to tie all these loose ends up, I needed eyes in different places. I mean, I love writing in first person, and it does make it very immediate. And that's one of my problems as a writer, is I don't do description well, you know, because I'm so interested in the dialogue and people talking and clashing. And first person kind of makes you be in that moment and see and feel and smell and, you know, hear. But it is somewhat limiting because you only have those eyes, you know, you can't, you know, somebody else can't tell you what's going on over here. I mean, do you always write in first person, or do you do third person as well?
I do third person also, but it's usually pretty deep third.
Okay.
So I kind of like the game of having to stay in a very close perspective and only being able to reveal what that person knows. At the same time, I just finished reading Catherine Addison's The Goblin Emperor.
Yes.
Which is a much more omniscient third.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked the way she kind of would seamlessly move between perspectives, and it made me envious. I was like, ooh, I want to be able to do that.
Yeah. Oh God, another master of that was Georgette Hare. I mean,
Yes.
she could change point of view in the middle of a page, and just and it's seamless. It isn't jarring.
It is. You would all of a sudden realize you were in someone else's head, and you're like, wait, when did this happen?
This happened, and yeah, and I mean, you know, I just, you know, I'm still like, okay, and now we have the little hashtag. We're going to new scene, new point of view.
Yeah.
You know, because I cannot figure out,
changing
yeah,
POV.
I don't know how she did it. So I know I stand in awe. Um, yeah, the other thing that I was really curious about and hoping that you delve into more is I was very curious about Leah's mother, because clearly I don't want to give away any spoilers, so I don't know how much to say, but yeah, I mean, we're going to find out more about Leah's nature, and also, you know, her father. He seems. I have a better sense of Conry's father than I do of hers, and yet he obviously had this huge impact on Leah. I mean, you know, and he wasn't a fool. I mean, he found a way to, you know, thread the needle.
Yes. Yeah, I think part of it's because Leah that feels more remote from her father in some ways. Even though he was a strong influence on her, I think she wasn't close to him in the same way. And I think more of that comes out in The Promised Queen. We certainly find out who Leah's mother is, and it's partly a big reveal. That's partly why I was coy with it.
Right.
Yeah, I guess even though her father was a very smart man and a clever man, I think that he was hard on Leah in some ways.
Oh, okay, because that didn't totally come across.
I'll have to fix that in book 3 and make sure it does.
Yeah, no, I got the feeling that, you know, that he loved her desperately, and he was desperately trying to prepare her for, you know.
That's probably true also.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it read to me. But then I'm,
Yeah.
you know, fathers are a big deal. And I didn't have a sense of how old Conry was when his father died. That he, you know, he doesn't seem to have had much male guidance either, you know. And I'm hoping we'll also learn, like, when did Ambrose hook up with him, you know. How did that all happen? So, and I love the fact that you don't have a wizard with a gray beard down to his belly button.
I so did not want Gandalf.
Yeah.
That's, again, you know, it's the sort of like doing my anti-Tolkien thing. But yes, I really wanted a wizard who was not a gray bearded sage.
Yeah, no, that was really enjoyable. Okay, so I have a question. I was intrigued by the choice you made at the end of the book, and again, no spoilers, but as a screenwriter, I would have stopped it at a darker place, and I wondered why you didn't.
Because my editor told me not to.
Really?
Yes, I was going to end it at a darker place also. And she said, well, because this is a romance, then we need to end at a happier point, or the romance readers will hate you.
Interesting.
Yes.
But I mean, you know, and I understand, obviously we have editors who tell us, you know, who give us guidance, and a market is a factor for us. However, do you feel like it, in some ways, it's weaker than you wanted it to be?
I guess I don't. I think that both endings are very emotional endings. I think that having a happy ending or an optimistic ending can be just as powerful emotionally as having a dark ending. So, yeah, I didn't mind. I was of two minds with it. I mean, I actually asked my editor. I said, I can end it this way or end it this way. And so, if I had been hugely invested in ending it in a darker place, which would have really been a cliffhanger. I mean, people are already complaining that the book's a cliffhanger as it is. And it was like, yes.
What?
Yeah, because because the whole thing's not resolved, because the overall political arc isn't resolved.
Yeah, but never mind.
I know, we could do the blah, blah, blah. But
I don't get that. I just do not get that.
If I had ended it in the darker place that I considered, then it really would have been a cliffhanger.
Yeah, and you know, I of course, perhaps being bleak in my nature, would have been fine with that. I was like, yeah, oh yeah, and so I'm trying to think if I have anything else in particular.
I think we could say that if it had been Game of Thrones, we would have ended it in the dark place.
Yeah, except that there would be no light afterwards.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, and so a different feel. But no, I found it interesting, because it looked like, oh, there's the end, and then, you know, there was more. But fascinating. Yeah, and I guess we don't have to think about, you know, like we're delivering medicine to our readers. You know, this is good for you. You have to, you know,
you must suffer.
You know, or you must, you know. On the other hand, I mean, there is this balance between, you know, what we feel artistically is stronger versus what the market demands from us, in a way.
Yeah, and I guess I didn't feel like it was, I thought that would have been a cool choice, but I wasn't so wedded to it that I felt like I needed to fight for it.
Yeah. I mean, is there anything particular you want to talk about building that world, or how you, I mean, because I don't want to say too much about the island, because there's a whole big mystery there too.
Yes, and that mystery really gets resolved in the third book also. So, I mean, there are things that are still hanging open. I know that, you know, but that's, you know, I really was excited to write this trilogy because I had really wanted to do a story that was a longer arc for the romance, for the two characters. I wanted to have that time for them to really grow and change as people.
Right. And did you, when you set it out, did you know before you started writing how the third book ended?
No, I never know how anything ends. So a lot of those reveals are things that I discover as I go. I know that they're mysteries, but then I have to find them out as I write. I would love to be one of these people who knows how things ends, because I think it's, like you say, you know your ending first, right?
Yeah. I knew the end of book 5 of Imperials before I started writing it.
Yeah, so. That sounds so, I don't know, so neat. It would be great to be able to do. But no, I just sort of have to wade my way through and sort of figure out how things end. And I end up stacking all these problems for my characters, and then I have no idea how they're going to get themselves out of it again.
Once more out of the well, yes.
Yes.
Well, I pretty much exhausted my questions. So,
okay.
You know, if you have any other, you know, conclusions or things you want to say, I'd love to hear them.
I don't think I do. I know that that I would like to read a little bit, that Beasley asked me to read a little bit, but I don't think you have to sit there and listen to it. So.
Well, and I got a business call. I had it all muted, so I should probably go ahead take that.
Well,
But
I know,
yeah,
Hollywood is calling. You must answer.
I wish. No. And but just curiosity, what section are you going to read? What do you think you're going to read?
I asked a couple people what I should read, and they said they thought that opening of chapter 2, when Leah and Con confront each other in the garden.
Yeah, I like that. I also love that promenade across the island that she forced him into. I could just picture that with the children throwing flowers and him sitting there, with point blossoms bouncing off his forehead with his
Glowering.
Yeah, like, oh, what is this? I thought that was just a wonderful whole sequence in there.
Thank you. I amused myself with that.
Yeah, I could just picture that scowl, and her doing the royal wave, hello, thank you.
And saying, you could wave once in a while, and
would a smile kill you? I mean, yeah, it was really nice. So, well, thank you for inviting me to do this, and
thank you so much for taking the time to do it.
With the series too. So,
thank you.
May this go very well for you.
Oh, I hope so. Thanks.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yes.
Books are the only thing keeping us all sane right now.
It's so true.
Yeah. So, well, thank you, Jeffe. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Bye. All right. Since Melinda suggested it, I will read from the scene where they are traveling across Calanthe, and in order to disguise the real purpose for this trip, Leah has made it into something of a public event so that her subjects won't be concerned about why she's doing this. So this is chapter 10, and it's from Leah's point of view. At least Con had stopped brooding and started talking, though I supposed if anyone could do both at once, he could. He held the flat and faceted amethyst oval I'd immediately recognized from a familiar floral relief in the palace, remembering how when he'd stormed my chambers, he'd carried a bag made of the pink silk of Lady Sandra's borrowed gown. Con must have pried many stones from the window border to make a bagaroka heavy enough to replace the ones my guards had confiscated. When he regained his leather one and kept only the amethyst, he would have had many left over. What did you do with the other stones? I asked. Busy gathering the rocks he had dumped out and putting them back in the worn leather bag, he cast me a questioning look. You would have pried out a number of them to make a weapon of any weight for escaping the prison tower, I clarified, but you only retained that one. Where are the others? I'd never have predicted that Con could look sheepish, but he eyed me, brushing the bits of dirt and sand off the plush seat, residue of his rock collection. Sorry about the dirt, he said, and I waved an impatient hand. Leave it. That's hardly important. You are ducking the question. He puffed out a breath, started to scrub a hand through his hair, and stopped himself, remembering he had it tied back. Zoraya and Nahua had done a sterling job of grooming him, though even their best efforts created only a sheen of polish over the restless predator. I rather enjoyed the contrast. I was going to mortar the stones back into place, but Ambrose took over the tower and won't let anyone in. I know. I let my own exasperation show. Not even the servants to clean. Though I think the wizard would make an exception for you. Nope. He grinned at me, a different smile than that feral grimace when he mentioned Kiosk, and far better than the haunted look his face had gotten when he spoke of the mines. With this smile, a dimple showed in one cheek just above his beard, a glimpse of genuine amusement. He likes you much better. I didn't think that was true. Ambrose had attached himself to Con for a reason that went beyond anything as prosaic as affection. Con was at the center of whatever the wizard's deep agenda included. So the stones? I prompted, morbidly curious now. I tossed them in that fish pond. I restrained a groan. You threw a small fortune in jewels into a fish pond. He searched my face, suspecting a joke. Jewels? Everyone? The pond had pretty rocks in the bottom already. Not precious gems, however. Why would you put jewels around a window in the first place? He burst out, waving a hand at nothing. Several young women, thinking he waved at them, squealed and tossed flowers. One swooned dramatically, her friends catching her with laughter. Khan seemed to be completely oblivious to his effect on them, as he had been with all the ladies and plenty of lads, who gazed at his impressive bulk and seething sexuality with overt longing. My wolf of a husband stood out, yes, but not in the way he thought. In point of fact, I didn't put them there, I replied as dryly as I could, since I really wanted to laugh. But consider this. If you're essentially an occupied kingdom, one that already ties heavily to a greedy overlord who plagues you with emissaries and spies, and you'd like to retain some wealth, just in case, what's a good way to hide precious gems in plain sight? Window decorations. He considered that. Your father was a clever man. Yes, well, cowardice and stupidity don't always go hand in hand. I suspect he wasn't a coward either, Khan said slowly, gaze on me. Oh, now there's a reversal, I said lightly to cover my surprise. Not what you implied yesterday. Khan tilted his head, adjusted the crown. The black stones in it were from Bergman, I realized. He'd crowned himself with the stones he had once mined. Maybe I'm learning there's all kinds of ways to fight, and not all of them include bashing things, he added, with a twist of a smile. Fortunate, as my palace would be denuded of decorations if everyone decided to make a bagaroka with precious gems. When we get back, I'll wade into the pond and retrieve them, he answered with rueful grit. When we got back. A lovely fiction to believe that we might return. There's no need. The fish probably ate them all anyway. I doubt that. And it clearly bothers you, so I'll make it right. Conrí, at my stern tone, he met my gaze. Now is a time that I am teasing you, I told him gravely. He narrowed his eyes, thought a moment. What about that blue outfit? I inclined my chin in gracious acknowledgement. That too. With a look of consternation, he stared at me a moment longer. You have a truly wicked sense of humor, he said, dawning realization in his voice. Did I? What an interesting idea to consider. I'd been so annoyed with him after that meeting and frustrated with myself that I couldn't indulge in sex with him and keep up my guard enough to hold him at arm's length. Messing with him by sending that ridiculous outfit had been an entertaining distraction from, well, everything. I supposed if I did have a sense of humor, I'd had little opportunity before this to exercise it. Mostly I'd amused myself in the discretion of my own thoughts, having learned long ago not to reveal how truly ridiculous I found most of the court posturing. In the pitch and gravity of recent events, I'd lost some of that internal satirical voice. Or perhaps I had discovered an outlet for it in my unlikely husband. I shall try to restrain myself, I offered. Oh, don't change the game now that I'm catching up. Is that what this is? A game? Absurdly, it pleased me that he didn't want me to change. He regarded me with alert interest. Sometimes I think everything is a game with you, except when it's deadly serious. True. His gaze wandered over my face. I like it, that a lot of what you do is part of your little joke on the world. It makes you more human. I caught my breath at the unexpected sting. Oh, how he had the power to pierce my armor. I must have looked stricken because he reached over, putting his hands around mine where I clutched the nosegay. I didn't mean it that way, he said. Not the real you stuff. I meant that you're always so regal and remote. He paused, searching for the words. Poised, he declared with some triumph. I see. I mean, knowing that you're laughing inside at your little jokes helps me understand you. Oh, well, that warmed my heart in another unexpected way, salved that sting. I see. All right. He didn't move immediately. You're sure? Con looked so earnest, with eyes soft with concern and that roughly handsome face, that I couldn't resist. And I'd missed touching him. I leaned in, tilting my head just enough to meet his lips and keep the crown balanced. The crown roared jubilation at the kiss, showering us with flowers and delighted cries. Con slipped a hand behind my neck, holding me there a moment longer, deepening the kiss, which turned quickly hot. Laughing breathlessly, I broke off, straightening. His gaze held mine, molten gold. I wanted you in the garden, even with hundreds of people watching. His voice echoed in my head, hoarse with desire, and I trembled, the need hitting me hard and fast, worse than ever for the one night of denial. A crowd pleaser, I managed to say, waving out both sides of the carriage to roaring approval. A fountain of magical flowers bloomed above, jetting from Ambrose's staff and raining down on us with soft sparkles. I wish Ambrose wouldn't do that, I commented, jumping at the distraction, working to keep the pleased smile on my lips instead of letting them firm with disapproval. Why not? Magic attracts attention. I'd think the wizard would know as much. Con shrugged. Probably. But if it's the imperial toad's attention, you mean, I'd guess that Ambrose knows this journey is partly designed to make sure we draw Anura's eye. I supposed he had a point. How can he know? He wasn't at the meeting when we discussed it. Apparently, he told Sandra he'd be ready to travel to Crodisica even before you came to visit me in the map room, and I asked you about the place. I tried to focus on that extraordinary information, not on what we'd done on that visit. Still, I had to search for words. You're saying Crodisica was inevitable? Con nodded, then shrugged. I don't know how this stuff works. When did you know that the wizard said this? Right before the meeting started. Sandra told me about a minute before you convened it. I considered that with some surprise. But you didn't use that in your arguments. He met my gaze, a raw honesty in his eyes. I never wanted to bully you, Leah. I know I can be an ass and I'm always sure I'm right, but I wanted to convince you that we can win. I believe we can. I didn't want to use predestination to push me into capitulation. Smiling slightly, he shook his head. You're about as easy to push around as I am. I found myself smiling back, the unexpected understanding humming between us. Another shower of showy magical fireworks went up, and I glared in the wizard's direction, much good as it did. I'd say that you should order him not to, but we both know that Ambrose does as he likes. Con sat back, folding his arms, muscles bulging in his shoulders beneath the closely tailored black silk and leather. He'd been so annoyed about that pastel blue outfit my ladies had pranked him with, and so relieved to see the real one, that he had simply put on this one without comment. He looked good in those clothes, though, deadly, physically powerful, as always, and also regal, more like the king of Oriel as he'd been destined, instead of the slave king. If you can figure, oops, sorry, oh, it's still him. If you, I only wrote it. If you can figure out how to govern the wizard, you will truly be a ruler to figure. He'd meant it as a joke, of course, but there was truth in that. How did you meet the wizard? I asked. Con cocked his head with a slight smile. By my count, it's your turn to tell me something. Ah, is that why you told me about the stones in your bag of roca and about the mines? That glimpse of horror remained in my mind like spoiled grease I couldn't quite cleanse from my mouth. I thought, yeah, I should tell you something about me if I'm going to ask about you. He glanced around as the road wound higher up in the hills, leaving the last of the crowds behind, the forest too dense on either side for anyone to gather. We'd have quiet until we reached the next village, and privacy. Seems like we have time, he noted, echoing my thought. And you owe me 2 answers, by the way. Pay up, sweetheart. We'll stop there. Thank you all for listening. Sorry that we couldn't do this in person, but someday we will meet again. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.